There are four areas to consider when managing our config and iOS files. 1. The location of those configuration files. Number 2. The syntax that we'll be using to manage and manipulate those files. 3. The boot locations of the iOS image. And 4. The backup and upgrade procedures that we'll use for our iOS images. Let's take a look at the first area, the location of the configuration files. There are two locations for our different configuration files. RAM, random access memory, is where our running config is contained. NVRAM, non-volatile random access memory, is where our startup config is located. The running configuration file is being used when the router is running, when the router is on. When the router is turned off, the contents of RAM are erased. When the router is rebooted, the configuration file that was saved in NVRAM, the startup config, is loaded into RAM as the running config. You can use the command show running config for the contents of RAM or show startup config for the contents of NVRAM. Any configuration changes that you make are saved in running config. In order to save those configuration changes, you issue the command copy run or copy running config startup config. Notice I'm using abbreviations here. Let me just say a word about those abbreviations. Say, for instance, there are two people in a classroom, one named Raleigh and the other named Ralph. And just for kicks and giggles, let's throw in a Ray. A package arrives destined for person R. You won't be able to tell who that package goes to with just that much information. So how about RA? Well, we still have confusion there. RAL, now we've narrowed it down and we can eliminate Ray. RALP. With just this much information, this indicates to us that it's not Ray and it's not Raleigh, but it's Ralph that this package is destined to go to. This is the same way that the abbreviations work with the syntax here. As long as you have enough letters to indicate which command you're specifying, the router can differentiate between the different commands. In some cases, you can just use one letter, like in the case of undebug. In other cases, like this case right here, you have to at least spell out a few letters. RUN for run. That indicates we want running config and startup config. So, the syntax to save our running config to our startup config would be copy run start or copy running config, running dash config, startup dash config. For your exam, keep in mind that you may have to spell some of the commands out. The iOS image is located in the flash. Flash is sort of like a hard drive. By default, this is where the router loads its iOS image. However, there are other locations that you could specify the router to boot from. Let's take a look at those. You specify different boot locations by using what we refer to as boot system commands. By default, as I indicated, the router boots from flash. So you could use the boot system flash command. To specify that you want the router to boot from an iOS image on the network, on a network server, you indicate boot system TFTP. Then you might specify the location as to where the iOS image might be located. If you want the router to boot from ROM, read-only memory, then you indicate boot system ROM. This is a special iOS image called the mini iOS that's located in ROM. It's also referred to as RX boot. This is a special, smaller, scaled-down version of the actual iOS file that's used for upgrading the system and used for other diagnostic and troubleshooting situations. To back up or upgrade your iOS image, you'll use the same syntax that we've talked about before, the copy from source to destination syntax. To back up the iOS image located in Flash, use the copy flash TFTP command. The router will then prompt you for the address of the TFTP server and the file name of the file that's located in Flash. In order to upgrade your iOS image, you would use the copy TFTP flash command. And then you'll indicate the iOS image that's located on the TFTP server. Then you'll indicate the IP address of the TFTP server along with the iOS image file name. These are the 4 areas that you would want to consider when managing your configuration and your iOS files.